Chris. Well, if you didn't get a handout, there's some in the chair back there. I have some extras up here. But welcome back after we took last week off. So 3 weeks ago, can everybody hear me okay? It's good. So 3 weeks ago, Gary spoke on basically this whole idea of treasures, looking at the book of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount and how Jesus talked about what our treasures are and where we should store them. And Gary talked about that in light of anxiety. And so what we're going to do today is basically zero in on one of those treasures, which is ourselves, and looking at our view of approval, acceptance, and where our peace and worth comes from as Christians, or I guess should come from as Christians, and the flaws we run into with that. And so we're talking about the fear of man tonight and what that means in terms of Scripture, what that means in terms of the way we view ourselves, and what we're afraid of, where our anxieties come up. Because I think in counseling, the fear of man is definitely a hot topic that, to be honest, most people don't really pay much attention to when they're coming in. Fear of man is not really on the radar. It's more of everything else, but fear of man definitely plays into everything. And so that's why we're going to look at it tonight. And I'll just start off saying it might not be exactly what you think. We're going to look at a very small slice of the pie, because the fear of man is, you could do a sermon series for a year on it and still not cover it. But so tonight we're going to really just kind of zero in on one little specific aspect, and that is looking at ourselves first. And so talking about the fear of man, first need to ask the question, why are we afraid of people? Why do we fear man? What is that whole thought? And a lot of this is coming from Ed Welch's book, When People Were Big and God Is Small. So if you've read that book, this might sound a little familiar, but I've tried to not just read it verbatim for you. But Ed Welch talks about we fear people, and he gives some reasons, saying we fear people because they can expose and humiliate us, they can reject us, they can ridicule us, they can despise us, they can attack us, they can threaten us, they can break up with us, they can abandon us. Any others y'all can think of? Because the list can go on and on. But those are the main ones that Ed Welch kind of brings out. And some pretty solid reasons to be fearful of man, right? This is not just one of those deals where I just tell you to chill out, it's not that big of a deal. No, sometimes it's kind of a big deal. And so that's why we're talking about it tonight. And so first we need to kind of figure out, okay, where did it come from? Where did it start? And I'm, sure you're already thinking, Genesis 3, the fall, where everything started, where every, good or bad sermon starts. And Genesis 3, I'll just read this quickly for us, but it picks up in the garden. It says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God actually say that you shall not eat of any tree in the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So, we all know what happens when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and then it was a delight to the eyes, that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. She took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was there with her." I might add, not doing anything, but just watching. And all of a sudden, both of their eyes were opened, and they knew that they were both naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. So this is interesting. We're going to stop right there, because looking at this, and it's like, okay, well, where's fear of man in that? I don't really see the other man that they're fearful of. And this is the whole thing, is to understand when we're talking about fear of man, we're really talking about ourselves and how we're reacting to other people. And so what happens here is we see that Satan introduces this simple doubt. He introduces this alternative reality. And if you were here for the first talk, you'll remember the alternative reality, the alternative hypothetical. There's always an alternative. And a lot of times we buy into that. And here, Satan presents this alternative reality, and Eve takes it full sail. She buys into it. And it's interesting because it says, Satan just poses the question, did God actually say? And then he adds, will you not surely die? Because God knows that if you eat from it, you'll become like him. And the interesting part here is Satan wasn't really wrong, because what we see is that when Eve ate of the fruit, her and Adam became like God, but their version of that, as you see, is that their eyes were opened and they knew that they were naked. All of a sudden, there's this idea of shame. All of a sudden, you see this idea that our version of becoming like God, we can't support that. We can't sustain that. So it's always going to end in some version of us feeling vulnerable, us feeling naked, us feeling ashamed, us feeling weak, because we're in a spot we shouldn't be in the first place. And so that's why we're starting right there, because that is pretty much the key that we're going to be looking at. That's going to be the recurring theme of to become like God equals nakedness, in this idea of us taking that role ourselves. And so what happened in all of that? What we see is that Scripture all of a sudden became a story about people who are scared, people who are afraid, people who have anxiety, people who fear other people, and people who feel vulnerable, exposed, naked. And therefore, we see that the concept of fear is a deeply biblical one. It is this deeply biblical concept that actually kicks off the redemption story. Fear is the first tree to fall there. And then the very next chapter, we get our first exhibit of the actual fear of man, where Cain looks at Abel and says, well, that's not fair. Like, he's better than me. I don't like that. I'm going to kill him. And it's like all of a sudden that thought came to Cain's mind of, oh yeah, I guess I could just kill him. I could just become like God and exhibit wrath. And you see the spiral there, that just starts everything. The Bible is just a repetition of that over and over and over again. And so now the world is a broken place where we're exposed and we can get threatened by others. Others can hurt us, and we hurt ourselves. And this is the first big distinction here, is that God does not view all of those in the same light. I'm not saying that if you get hurt by another person, it's always your fault, okay? Just first blanket statement out of the way. I don't want y'all thinking that I'm just saying up here, oh, you just need to get over it. Like, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is God views all those differently, and that's why fear of man is so complex, because it really is a case-by-case study and how this applies to you. And so that's where we're kind of looking at this one specific view here and seeing that, a lot of the time, in counseling especially, when someone comes in with a problem with another person, me, Gary, Jill, Jillian, we can't really do anything about that other person. You as the counselee can't really do anything about their actions against you. So what we have to focus on is this idea of, okay, well, if there is a dispute, we have to first look at the log in our own eye. And I'm not saying there's always a log, again, back to the blanket statement, before you ask the question of, does that mean that it's my fault always? No, it doesn't, but it means that we have to examine, all right, well, what could be that log? Let's look at yourself. How are you reacting to the situation? What can you do to be more like Christ? And so, first we need to kind of talk about this idea of guilt and shame, because this is where we're starting. And so we're going to mainly focus on shame, but first we need to differentiate the two, because I feel like a lot of the times when I ask that question, people have in their minds the same thing. It's not really the same thing, because guilt is basically the fact of a crime, the fact of an injustice. So if I go down to the bank and take money, it doesn't matter if I can argue some, really high-level idea that laws are, irrelevant because we're humans and, we're survival of the fittest. Laws don't apply to me. Doesn't matter. I still took something that doesn't belong to me. Therefore, the law in my heart, written there by God, tells me that's wrong. So there is this innate guilt that we all suffer from, we all get into every now and then. But then shame, on the other hand, is this idea, it's the feeling of humiliation because of a past or potential wrongdoing. Again, we're getting kind of technical here. So also, if y'all have any questions, please feel free to stop me at any second, because I am going to be going kind of fast, and I don't mean to. But, so shame is this feeling of humiliation because of a past or a potential wrong behavior. And I was at a youth retreat a few weeks ago talking on this very subject, and I made the mistake of asking, it was going to be kind of a joke of like, who here's ever felt shame? And raise your hand, thinking everybody would raise their hand, but only like 3 people raised their hand. I was like, uh-oh, that's not good. And the idea, though, is that we've all felt shame at one point in our life, whether we want to admit it or not. And my 2-year-old, Lewis, he has felt shame. I walk into the den, and he's sitting there with both remotes in both hands looking at the TV. And I say, Lewis, what are you doing? He's like, just looks at me like, uh-oh, how do I play this off? Here you go, Daddy, I got the remotes for you. He felt shame. He knows when something has been wrong, when he has done something wrong. And so, shame is basically the reminder that's always there that no matter how perfect we make our surroundings, shame is the constant reminder that we can never be perfect. Shame is the constant reminder that we will not be God, that we will not reach God's status. And it's an important point that we're going to kind of come back to. But this kind of gets into this idea of, well, what does our culture think about it? What culture do we live in terms of the way they view shame? Well, Ed Welch alludes to this idea of low self-esteem, saying that low self-esteem is basically, he calls it secularized shame. And what he means by that is saying, this is the way that our culture has dealt with shame to make it not sound too bad, to make it not our fault. And again, it's not always our fault, but most of the time, it's because we've done something wrong. And so this idea of low self-esteem is a very hot topic, and so some of you, you're welcome to disagree with me. I'm not saying that, I'm right and you're wrong, but this is my view, that self-esteem can be a very dangerous idea if it's taught in the wrong way, because the whole problem with it is it revolves around self. It revolves around you. And if you tell me that you have low self-esteem because people won't take you seriously, then my question to you is, well, how is boosting your pride going to actually help that situation? Or if you're already struggling with the way that you think about yourself, how is you thinking about yourself more going to actually solve that situation? And the problem there is that you see that the entirety of the problem is you're too focused on yourself. But you mask that with this idea of what others think of you. Now again, we're getting really into the weeds here. I'll say that again. But the entirety of the problem with thinking about self-esteem is that you're too focused on yourself, but we don't realize it because we mask it with, it's not my fault, it's their fault. It's the way they're treating me. And again, still, that could be an issue, but we're focusing on this one little slice of the pie here, because this is what we could run into on the everyday level. And seeing that it's this repetition of a circular trap that we see that, we have low self-esteem, so we need high self-esteem. But then just because we have high self-esteem, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Let's see how that works in realistic, real world problems. And seeing that a lot of the times, words do actually hurt you. They have quite an impact. So we have to understand how to deal with it ourselves in this idea of self-esteem, seeing that first and foremost, our esteem, first off, does not come from yourself. This is an interesting idea. But Isaiah 43, God says, "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I've called you by name. You are mine." Therefore, our esteem doesn't come from anywhere else other than God. We are his creature. We are his creation. Therefore, he has given us all the esteem, all of the self-respect that we need being created by him. And so, you basically can't escape that something is wrong just by saying, I need to feel better about myself. If you are the God that is dealing out that esteem. So you guys staying with me? I know it's kind of getting thick into the weeds, but we can definitely ask some questions at the end if we need to go back through anything else. But practicality, okay, the good stuff. How does this actually apply to our lives? Where does this come out? Well, it happens probably once a week where in the morning I'll stand in front of my closet and I'll look at my shirts and I'll think, okay, who am I seeing today? Because I see people pretty regularly, on the weekly or bi-weekly basis. And I start thinking, I don't have that many shirts. So if someone keeps coming, they're eventually going to catch me wearing the same shirt again. And I actually dedicate probably 3 to 4 minutes thinking about this. All because I'm afraid of what people are going to think about me. Like, oh my gosh, Braden only has one shirt. He just goes home and washes it every night, I hope. And this is the whole idea of seeing that, man, realistically, and it's funny because I'll notice sometimes that they're wearing the same thing, but I don't care about that because that's not why we're there. It's not a fashion contest. It doesn't matter because I'm so wrapped up in myself that it doesn't even cross their mind probably. Or if it does, they don't say anything, but that's the whole point. And so that's one example. Another example is walking into class or walking into a meeting, thinking the same thing of, what are they thinking about me? How do I look? Am I walking weird? Is something wrong with my hair? What if they ask me to talk? Oh gosh, I don't know, I'm not prepared. I'm just gonna leave it on mute. I'm not gonna turn my camera on these days, with Zoom calls. And we post a picture on social media, and man, it only got 10 likes. The last one got 15. What happened? I need to go check my followers. Did I lose some? Did I do something wrong? Am I not posting enough? You start in this long dialogue with yourself that is absolutely pointless, that has absolutely no effect on your day-to-day life, other than it makes you stressed out. And there's a lot more we can go into, but I'll leave it there for now. And so what's the answer to all this? You're a biblical counselor. Where does the Bible the answer? And so a lesser used verse, in my opinion, on fear is actually the verse that's mostly used for love. 1 John 4:18. For there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and the one who fears is not made perfect in love. So that's an interesting verse. I'll read it again. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment, and the one who fears is not made perfect in love. So if fear has to do with punishment, then we got to ask, well, what are we afraid of punishing us? Is it other people? Is it ourselves? Is it God? Where is that fear of punishment coming from? What are we so afraid of in actuality? And we see again that our insecurities, our esteem, is masking what's truly happening. Saying that most of the time, it's not the other person that we're actually afraid of, but it's our own pride and our own self-righteousness and our own status and our own sense of being in control that gets threatened. That's where we become afraid. That's what we're really afraid of. And then that makes us react out of fear, out of self-preservation, out of protection of self. Seeing that a lot of the times people, difficult people especially, just simply pry open that mask that you've worn so well. And all of a sudden, you're in danger. Your control is in danger. Remember what Gary was talking about. Your treasure is being threatened. And this is where we're zeroing into the treasure of seeing, okay, that treasure of self is being threatened by other people. And I can guarantee you it will be threatened by other people on a daily basis from here on out. Regardless, if you could work at a daycare. And well, that might be a bad example because it would be threatened a lot because kids have no filter and they say a lot of honest things that you don't want to hear. But it's beside the point. There's this quote that says, "Fears see only in part. They see that we might lose something that's dear to us, as our money or our health or the health of someone we love, or I might say our status. And they see the potential for loss with a microscopic, acute focus. And what they don't see is God's presence. They don't see his faithfulness to his promises. They don't see, or they don't fixate on the unseen realities, but are dominated by what is merely seen with our eyes. That is 2 Corinthians 4:18, saying that what is unseen is eternal, but what is seen is material. It fades away. It's fleeting. And so, brings us back to the main idea. If we're going to shift our focus back to God from ourselves, then the only solution there is not to try harder to shift your focus on God. First, you got to get yourself out of the way. First, we have to forget about ourselves. And now, if most of you might be familiar with this guy named Tim Keller, who's written a pretty good book on the freedom of self-forgetfulness. It's a small book, it's approachable, it's readable, and it's very striking to this point that I'm making tonight, is forgetting about ourselves. And he wrote this book addressing our ego and our self-judgment. And he first launches it off of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3:21 through 4:4. And I'll read that for you because I didn't put that on your handout. But Paul says, "So let no one boast in men, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours, and you are Christ, and Christ is God's. This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of the stewards that they may be found faithful. But with me is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I don't even judge myself, for I am not aware of anything against me, but I am not thereby acquitted, but it is the Lord who judges me." So again, kind of a weird passage to look at this and look at the fear of man, but this is what Paul's talking about, saying that our fear of man thrusts us into a role that we cannot fulfill. It thrusts us into this role of judge. And most of the time, we are the main defendant that is being judged. And you see how it's this circular trap again, where you're the one trying to plead your case to yourself, who's also the judge, and also probably the executioner and the prosecutor and everybody else in court. And so Tim Keller, he points out that this is an ego problem. This has a lot to do with ego, because the ego, he says, is four things. He says it's empty, it's painful, it's busy, and it's fragile. And I might add one more, not to add to Tim Keller, but misguided. That's another one that I see a lot of times. And so running through this, I did put that on your handout. Empty, he talks about this as basically any version of self-importance. It is going to rely on another person to give you that self-importance. So every single interaction then becomes transactional. So let me spell that out. I will pay my importance. Let's use social media as an example here. I will pay my importance with a like. Man, I liked your picture. What an honor for you. And yet, I expect for you to like my picture because I liked yours. We share importance here because it's a transaction. I give you some, you give me some, we're happy. And then, so you take that into the day-to-day work life of, well, I asked about your weekend. You gonna ask about mine? Because I did this pretty cool thing that I can't wait to share for you. What did you say? I forgot about what you said. That's, again, harsh, but pretty on point for a lot of our day-to-day conversation. And so the ego is empty, and it creates this economy without a real currency that can't be sustained because everyone is just caring about themselves. Again, it's back to that circular thing where we're all just in a room talking to ourselves. We all have these separate rooms that are portable, and we walk around all the time. And so it's empty, it's painful, because if we're in this circular court of self, all of a sudden we're going to get hurt. We realize it's actually kind of pointless. We don't get out of this what we wanted to get out of it. We feel empty for some reason. We feel lost. We feel alone. We feel secluded. We feel like hurt. We don't know where it came from. It's painful because we feel rejected. And then it's busy because if it's painful, we're going to have to work overtime to make up for that pain. Saying that if we're hurt, then we're going to run faster. And I think Gary said this last time, to where anxiety is running away from something, but Gary, what was the phrase? Do you remember? It's running away from something, but you're too tired to run, but too scared to stop. That's what he said. And this is where it comes in. It's painful and busy. And if it's busy, if we're running so fast, all of a sudden it's going to get a little fragile. We're going to start to feel when you're in your old car going a little too fast and it starts to shake and kind of scream at you, like, what are you doing? I can't sustain the speed. And it's fragile because the second that you don't have that connection, the second you don't have that fulfillment that you're seeking, all of a sudden you're kind of back to empty. And you see there's the cycle. And then it starts all over. I mean, think about this again, at that youth retreat, they put me in this cabin and I was all alone and it didn't really have cell service or internet. So I walked in and sat on the couch, and it was kind of like one of those moments where you realize, like, I don't think I've done this in probably 6 months of just sitting in a room by myself, silent. And it kind of scared me. It was kind of like, ooh, I don't like that. I need something to do. I need somebody to talk to. I need internet, I don't want to watch Netflix, and it's scary. And then misguided, because this comes back to what we talked about in Genesis 3, of it's constantly convincing yourself that you are God and you need worship. And it doesn't mean that we're always in active rebellion to God, acting like we're going around claiming we're God. No, it's a lot more subtle than that. It's this idea that we're in control of our world, and that's all that matters. And and seeing that it thrusts ourselves in that position that brings on these expectations that we can't uphold. You can't be God. You can't support your own life. You can't support your own will. You can try. You can get pretty close, honestly, but it's never going to give you the fulfillment because you're not God. You're trying to do something that you can't do. And this is what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, and he presents the solution. You cannot be your own judge, nor can we depend on the judgment of others. And now, dangerous statement, because obviously, if someone's sinning, I'm not telling you, you don't need to call them out for their sin because you don't want to judge them. No, there's certain stipulations of, biblical reasoning. It's important to know your whole Bible, of understanding that, yeah, of course there's times where you're going to have to actually judge and have to actually convict and bring conviction. But when you're looking at yourself, that has to be, you have to get that log out of your own eye first. You have to understand what's actually happening here. And so we're narrowing it down to basically when we're controlled by fear, especially when people are involved. And so going on to that last section there on the handout, and this will go a little bit faster, but understanding that fear is, this is if you're a Paul Tripp fan, this is his kind of motto of fear is the forgetfulness of the truth that we already have. And it's funny because I never really made that connection for a long time, that me being afraid of something was me actually forgetting something. Me being afraid of something was more of just about me trying to fix what I want. And seeing that fear is forgetfulness of the truth that we already have. And so I'm going to read a few Psalms here, and one from, well, it's kind of all over the place, but in Psalms, Proverbs, and Isaiah, just truth statements of classic one. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Psalm 27, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Proverbs 19, the fear of the Lord leads to life, and whoever has it rests and is satisfied. Isaiah 41, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous hand. Psalm 34, I sought the Lord and he answered me. He delivered me from my fears. And it's funny because I was reading this in my office earlier today, preparing for this. And I read through it just like that, thinking, that was a good job. But I bet if I asked y'all to say one of those, you'd probably pick Psalm 23. But that's the thing, is I couldn't say one of those. I just read it. Because they all kind of sound the same, don't they? They all just kind of sound repetitive. They sound, we know it, right? It falls into that category in our minds of, well, yeah, that's truth, I know it. But where's the good stuff? Where's the 5 steps to getting out of fear? And it's a good point. And that's what I fell for. But the thing is go back to it. Reread it again. This idea of saying, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Saying that, hold on, sounds really good, it looks really good in the frame picture, but again, do we really believe in the moment that God is with us? That God is actually capable of fixing something? I mean, something. Do we really believe that God is with us in those moments where we're in that locked-in cycle of the ego? And Paul Tripp, he says, when the fear of God overwhelms and controls your heart, it protects you from the paralyzing and debilitating fear of other things. And this is where Gary's going to wrap this up with a little, promo, but the fear of God will be the last thing that we talk about, because that is the final solution to outrunning fear of everything. And again, we've been hinting at it, and we'll get there, but what Paul Tripp says is, when the fear of God overwhelms and controls your heart, then you are protected. And so that's one of the truth statements that we have. And also, we have this example right in front of us. We just read through it in the Easter week of Jesus. And Matthew 26 and 27, I think, is the most pointed to what I'm talking about right now, because we see that Jesus, he feared no man. And again, obviously you can say, well, he's Jesus. He kind of knew what was going on. But no, he was a man. He lived and breathed just like us. He feared no man. And he was the living example that John wrote about a few years later in 1 John 4, seeing that his perfect love drove out fear. Literally drove it out, saying that he knew that his reputation was going to be slandered, and yet he continued. He knew that people were not going to appreciate him. They're not going to approve of him, and yet he continued. He knew that people were going to physically assault him, hurt him, lay their hands on him, shake him up, spit on him, and yet he continued. And he allowed the very people that he healed to pick a murderer over himself. And yeah, it's funny because he knew who was in control the entire time. And not once, where we would read that as man was in control of Jesus the whole time. No. Like, Jesus was in control the entire time. And yet he was still allowing that to happen. He was walking through the stages of fear of man, basically, for us to see, for us to have that example. And I think the most comical part of this is Pilate, who walks in, in his great, regalia. And he looks at Jesus and says, "Do you not know that I can free you?" And you got to imagine Jesus just like looking at him being like, "This guy, okay, yeah, that's funny." And Jesus' response is, "You have no authority over me unless it has been given to you from above." And the audacity that Pilate thought, "Hey, I got control here, right? I can free you. You don't have to go through all this stuff." And Jesus just telling him, "You're so ignorant. You don't know what you're doing. And yet, yeah, let's go. Let's get it over with. Come on. I'll walk out there first." And that's how Jesus responded to fear, looking straight at him in the eyes. And you see that the one who had authority over him was not man. It was not even Satan. Man, you got to know Satan was on the edge of his seat thinking, "Oh, I've got him. Finally, this guy, I've got him." But no, it wasn't Satan. It was God himself. It was his Father. And then we have this reversal, this mirror image of Peter, who did basically the opposite of everything Jesus just did. Jesus even told him, "Hey, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows." And Peter, just thinking, "No, come on, Jesus. We go back. I'm your friend. You trust me. I trust you." And then the second, it wasn't even like a pump fake. The second he was presented with it, "Oh, no, I don't know. He's not my friend. I have no clue who that guy is." "Yeah, let's go get him." Peter fell right in line. He was terrified because he didn't want to be exposed. And so, moving on to that next part, we'll come back to Peter in a second, but how do we walk with this reverence of God as Jesus did? How do we walk with this confidence? Because, like I said, we're not Jesus. I'm kind of afraid to die. I don't want to, I don't want somebody to beat me up because I don't want to feel pain. I like being comfortable. How do we give some emphatic gravitas to our trust in the Lord and seeing that reverent fear for the Lord? Well, I gave you here's your few practical steps that you're looking for. First is walking through the Psalms, because the Psalms are the index of the Christian heart, as Calvin put it. And what I do in counseling a lot is I will give, depending on the problem, I'll pick out a few Psalms that are pretty much along the lines of what they're dealing with. And I'll say, "I want you to read all of these." It's a big homework assignment, And but what I want you to do in that is I want you to go through, highlight, underline the most impactful statements that speak directly to you. And then I want you to pull that out and write it on a separate sheet of paper. And I want you to do that once with every Psalm. And this is what I did for you guys, just to kind of give you an example of what I'm talking about. So I wrote down Psalm 5, 27, 31, 55, 56, and 140, because those are all dealing with people who are assaulting you being afraid of people. And I just looked at, for myself, what was the most impactful statements in those Psalms for myself. In Psalm 5, "The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and the deceitful, but I, by the abundance of your steadfast love, will stand before you and bow down to you, O God." Psalm 27, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, for whom shall I fear?" And then the next one, "My times are in your hands, God." Then the next one, "Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. For what can man do to me? The Lord will maintain his cause, the cause of the afflicted, and he will execute justice for the needy." So what I've done is I'm not telling you to go write your own psalm or add to the Bible or anything, so let's calm down. But what I am telling you to do is actually use Scripture for what it's meant for. Read it. Speak it back to the Lord, for he delights when we speak his own words back to him. Because again, he created us. I love it when Lewis looks at me and tells me something that I just said. It might be goofy. It might be, something utterly pointless. But man, that's so sweet. It has such an intimate bond. And the Lord delights in that when we do that for him. And so that whole block of text, each one of those sentences came from a different psalm, and yet it sounds like I just wrote a psalm that was directly akin to what I was struggling with in that moment. And so, again, that's just an exercise, a way we can use the Bible to actually walk into our day-to-day life, for our devotion, for our use. Number 2 is pretty simple, but also probably the hardest one to do. Talk to somebody. Get another opinion. Have somebody listen to you that's actually going to listen to you. And I'm not saying that you got to come to counseling. I'm saying talk to your spouse, talk to your kids, talk to your parents, talk to your friends that you can trust. Because fear is a very lonely place. And sometimes we need another person to pry us out of that, to enlighten us to the truth that we're not believing in that moment. And God uses people around us very well if we allow him to. And third, pray for clarity about what you're actually afraid of. Because a lot of times we're very trusting in our own ability to decipher what we're actually afraid of. But I gave you a few questions to ask. These are good, solid counseling questions, but questions that really make you think about, the first question, what is the worst possible outcome of this? Well, you might say, I might get fired. Someone might kill me. Or, I might lose someone I love. Those are real things. I'm not just trying to make light of everything. This is a very hefty topic. And there might be answers there that you need to actually work through. The next question, how likely is this to actually rationally happen? Again, go back to the shirt metaphor, that goofy metaphor I gave you that's real. How likely is it, how rational is the thought that I'm going to wear a shirt that someone's seen me in before and I'm going to go to work and they're not going to come back to counseling because I don't have another shirt? They probably don't need to be in counseling if they're leaving for that reason. And again, that can apply to a lot of different things though. Do people agree with my view? Do people actually agree with my point of view? Am I wrong? Because that is always a possibility, believe it or not, that we can actually be wrong about something. We can overblow it. We can actually interpret a situation for the wrong reason. Because again, if we're wrapping all this together, we're not a very good judge of what truth is if we're at the center of our world. And so, do people actually agree with my point of view? And then the fourth question, am I acting out of pride or self-preservation? Am I just trying to protect myself here? And if you are, there's good reasons. Like if you're in danger, yeah, you need to protect yourself. But a lot of times, it's this idea of, well, no, I'm just wanting to protect my pride. I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to be exposed. I don't want to be humiliated. Next question, am I acting like God or am I submitting to God? Coming back to that same thought that we've been talking about of who is God in any given moment? Is it you or is it the actual God who created you, who loves you, who's formed you, who has called you by name, who's claimed you for his own, who says, you are precious in my eyes and honored and loved? Do we really believe that? Because if God is saying that you're precious, then if something's precious to you, you know the well-being of that thing and you know where it is at all times. You are precious to God. And do we act like, do we submit to that? Are we okay with being precious to God? Or do we like our own little kingdom? And the last question, am I acting like Jesus or Peter? I told you we'd come back to Jesus and Peter. It's a pretty solid example of, do we walk into a situation where we know that the outcome might not be great, and yet have faith that the Lord will come through? Have faith that the Lord will work, even if it's a bad outcome? Or are we like Peter, who says, regardless of what the outcome is, I'm running away. I don't want to deal with this. I know a lot of times I'm like Peter, if not all times. And then another one that I didn't put on there, just this final thought of we have to put our faith over our fear. Our fear cannot be our religion that demands worship. It can be a very difficult external environment that we are in. But even in those moments, our faith still has to be in the Lord. It cannot be, our religion cannot be fear. It cannot be ourselves. We cannot sustain that role as our own God. And saying that we have to submit to his will instead of our own at the end of the day. And so, like I said, that was a lot. That was very fast. That was very skating along the surface of a very fine point of the fear of man. And like I said, this is kind of what I wanted to end with, is fear of man cases are pretty much case by case. There's so much uniqueness to whereas a lot of other cases pretty much run together. When there is other people involved, especially difficult people or hard situations that people have put you in a vulnerable spot, especially if that means some form of assault or some form of abuse, that requires a lot more than just this one little seminar, because that's not what I was talking about tonight. And that's why I told you it might not be what you expect to hear, because I could talk about that, but I wouldn't do it justice talking about it in 45 minutes. That requires a lot more information. That requires a lot more delicacy. So that's why I kind of avoided that. Not on purpose, but simply to give it the gravitas it needs. And so that's where I would encourage you, if you're sitting there with questions, or if you're watching with questions about, well, he didn't mention anything about this situation that I've been through. Well, that's where I would go back to, cite, Roman numeral 3, subpart C, subpart 2, talk to somebody. You can't just bear that on your own. You have to walk with somebody through that is actually going to take the time to listen. And we are available for counseling. We do care about you guys. We do want to provide that for you, and we want to do it the best we can in that. So biblical counseling is, that is the reason for biblical counseling, to take these big issues that seminars don't really cover and dive deep into them to where it's one-on-one. And it's kind of this dialogue of, I'll be talking kind of similar to what I'm saying right now, but you can actually say, hold on, I don't understand that. What do you mean? Because that makes no sense to me. That's what counseling is. It's not this scary thing where we go and talk about our feelings, which, sometimes it is, but, it's not scary. It's for your benefit. It's for the purpose of getting outside yourself and placing God back on that throne where he should be, where things can actually go well, to where you can actually have peace and joy and contentment, even if your world is falling apart. It's possible. But all that being said, let me pray for us, and then I'll open it up for if there's any questions. But let me pray for us real quick. Lord, this is such a daunting topic of something that is a subset of another topic, and that is when people are big and you are small, when people are physical and people are mean and people are difficult. God, I do pray that you would calm our hearts, that you would address us in a way that we can hear, that you would walk us through, even though we're in the valley of the shadow of death, that you would take our hand and lead us beside still waters. Lord, let your truth become real to us, for you are our God, and we run way too quickly from you. So I pray that you would just do this now, Jesus. I pray this in your name. Amen. And I'd like to open up if there's any questions. Still got a few minutes, but also if you're online, please feel free to email me. You can get our info on the owencenter.com. But any questions? Chris?
Right. Can you speak to particularly difficult counseling situations where you have someone who maybe clearly is suffering some kind of schizophrenia or paranoid schizophrenia disorder,
Mm.
where perhaps counseling is just not the only answer?
Yeah. And just speaking to the kind of what to do with that. Yeah. That happens a lot more than you think, to be honest. And that's where me or Gary or one of our other counselors will make a judgment call pretty early on in the counseling process of there might be something else at play here that we can't really control. And a lot of times it's schizophrenia, sometimes it's other type of disorders or diagnoses. And I would say with that, there's a responsible, you have to acknowledge the medical side of things. I don't sit in my office and think, I got this. I can cowboy this and get it done. Yeah, no, that would be very irresponsible and foolish. And so there's certainly times where I've referred people out, or I try to ask around, I try to know who they're seeing. And I know what they're saying. I know who they're seeing and what they're saying, what they're hearing. And I don't just sever biblical counseling, because I think that's the most important part, is having biblical counseling to have wisdom in those situations. Because there's a lot of just typical health situations that, people with certain diseases, certain just health disabilities that I can't really do anything with. I don't really know anything about it. But what I can do is help them interpret what their doctor's saying in the way of their heart and the way they're responding, and coming back directly to fear and saying, okay, well, just because my body is disabled, just because I have schizophrenia, just because I have bipolar, just because I have even depression, that does not mean that the Bible is not for you anymore. That quite actually means, yeah, that's specifically what the Bible is for. People who are suffering. And so that's where I would just say it's case by case, because sometimes I don't necessarily think that it's that big of a deal. They might be more on the fear side of things, of thinking they have certain things. But again, it's hard to speak to specifically because everybody is very different. And so I don't want to make any big blanket statements. But for the most part, there is a blanket statement, is that biblical counseling is still for that situation, but it's never, I never want to say that I'm going to fix your medical condition, because I know what I'm doing as a, fancy doctor. I'm not a doctor. Make that very clear. You have to sign a sheet before you come to counseling at the Owen Center, understanding that we're not medical doctors. And so we can't prescribe medication. And so that doesn't mean that we're against it. It means that we want to wisely walk you through what you're actually getting into. So that's my short answer, but I can speak more to it if there's any more questions to that. Any other questions? Yeah, Norman.
So I think in terms of fear of man, when it came about David in the Psalms, he's being chased and spears are being thrown at him, and physical harm and death. In so much of today's environment, my own, I'm in the office setting.
Mm-hmm.
It's a war of ideas, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you talk to counselees about the balance between trusting God but also preparing yourself for those attacks and battles?
Yeah.
So that you can, I guess the most often non-biblical quote that is attributed to the Bible is God helps those who help themselves.
Yeah.
Not the,
Yeah.
But that concept of being prepared but also trusting God in that preparation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So to repeat it, you're asking about the concept of, repeat it one more time, just
the concept of preparing yourself for
yeah.
the attack so that you
Yeah,
can
got it. Yes.
not only protect yourself but also be confident in your preparation that God has given you.
Yeah, so for those online, how do you prepare yourself for actual attacks? Like, how do you build up that confidence to actually trust in the Lord, but still be responsible and not just be a doormat? Is that basically what you're asking? Yeah. So that's a good question, because there does come this idea of personal responsibility, and I mean, just putting it frankly, like not being a doormat. And that's where I would say, first and foremost, that is such a fine line between you handing God over the control and you taking the control. And so that's where that wisdom you really have to have that wisdom of who is actually in control here. And I think the best biblical reference to that is the book of Haggai in chapter 2, where God tells them, I want you to rebuild my temple. And they say, I can't do that. And he gives them this response that says, work, for I am with you. Fear not, my spirit remains in your midst. For I'm doing a new thing. I'm making a new covenant. I'm building this house. But I want you to be a part of it. And so there's this call to responsibility of God still wants us to work. God still wants us to prepare. God still wants us to be responsible Christians. He doesn't want us just aimlessly flying through life saying, oh, the Lord is my salvation. Come get me. That's not what God wants us to do. And maybe I should have harped a little bit more on that. But it's this idea of understanding that there's this call to work, but it's working in light of what God's already done and what he's doing. And submitting yourself to that process of, you don't know the outcome of, God, I don't know how to build this house. God, I don't know how to protect myself from these people. But I'm going to trust that if you're asking me to do certain things, you're actually going to give me the capability to do certain things. But I'm not going to sit and wait for the Spirit to deliver it to me. I'm going to be proactive and actually understand. I mean, just case in point, like, I knew I had this talk tonight, and therefore it would have been very, prideful of me to walk in here thinking, I got it. I don't even need to study. No, I spent a lot of time today looking over this, studying it. And I was still scared. But it's this idea that the Lord is good. He's going to prepare me, my heart. He's going to use this even if I fail, because I'm trying to glorify him through it. Does that make sense? It's kind of a weird, backdoor answer, but it's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. Any other questions? We'll sing none. In 2 weeks, Gary will speak on parenting your anxious child. So even if you don't have children, it's still an important topic. It's still going to be on anxiety. It's still going to be something that you can apply. And being a community of believers, you need all the knowledge you can get to help all the people that you can. And we are called to support one another, so you never know when you might be thinking, that situation is never going to come up. You never know, because you might talk to somebody tomorrow that's like, hey, I have this situation. You're like, oh, they're asking for my opinion. Okay. So Gary's going to talk on parenting, and then the last talk, Gary's going to come back and talk on the fear of the Lord and what that actually means. So with that, I'll dismiss you. If you got any questions, I'll be here for a little bit, and or email me.